How do you expect this to play out? Is this a short-term set of scenarios in Thailand, or are these demonstrations likely to play out over the long term?
Well, in the short term, we will see a lot of tension, David. There's been an emergency decree. We've seen some of this in Thailand before over the last 2 decades. There have been protests, there have been 2 military coups, 2 new constitutions, and then more protests. This time, I'm sensing that it's a little bit different. The protest looks familiar, but profoundly different in the sense that the young people, young generation, people born after 1980, David, they're leading the charge, they're leading the calls to reform. There are 3 main calls now, 3 main demands now have to do with the resignation of the incumbent Prime Minister, General Prayuth, who seized power in 2014, and also to have a new constitution so we can reset the game in Thailand so that it becomes more democratic, genuinely democratic, and then to reform the monarchy. Now, the last demand, the third demand, is very sensitive in Thailand. This is the issue, the crux of the issue now. Yesterday, the protests, a lot more people showed up on a weekday than many anticipated, but there was some encounter with a royal motorcade that became a spark and catalyst for a crackdown. So now we will see repression, not reform, and I think the grievances will pile up or accumulate. But in the longer term, we will see more manifestations of dissent. In the short term, more repression and crackdown.
So more of a crackdown in the long term. Does that suggest that there's any desire from government officials to start a conversation with these demonstrators? Is there any sense that they are prepared to give ground, the government, on any of these issues?
On the one hand, the demands are very daunting. This is an uphill task for the protesters. On the other hand, the incumbent institutions of power in Thailand, they come from the Cold War. These institutions, the military, the monarchy, the bureaucracy, the judiciary. Over the last 2 decades, Thailand has been brought to a standstill. We're seeing early signs of economic stagnation, a lot of political repression. Thailand has fallen behind our regional peers. So these young people now, my students' generation, they are reclaiming, they're demanding their future back, because otherwise they won't have jobs. I mean, they will have to live in Thailand for another 60 years, unlike myself, much shorter time. So for them, they want Thailand to move ahead, to have a future. The other side, I think the incumbent institutions of power, they have not shown any sign of compromise and concession. But what we've seen from them actually is the contrary, which is repression and crackdown. So you'll see now a lot more tensions building up, and then this will be very combustible. It will also depend on the young generation, if they can organize. I mean, they have a broad-based organic movement, but it's not very well organized. The grievances are very genuine, very widespread, but they have to find ways to channel them into a broader movement.
Professor, this is David. Since you mentioned, then, you obviously speak to your students a lot, so there is that consensus among the young people in Thailand. I mean, I'm curious because we got that state of emergency declared today, and our understanding is the protesters, and speaking of something next, might actually come out again today to protest that state of emergency. You've alluded to the fact that because authorities have certain regulations in place, that what we're seeing on the streets is a very small portion, perhaps, of what it would be were it not for those regulations to be in place. Do you think sentiment among the young people and the students is also representative of the greater population in Thailand?
Yes, the protest dynamics, David, this time is new. And I think it's driven by the new information technologies that we've seen in play. So, for example, in cyberspace, it's almost a parallel universe. In cyberspace, in Twitter, in social media networks, there have been thousands and even 7-digit numbers of protesters and dissidents and people who are critics. But on the street, on the ground, in the street, there are fewer. There may be more than 10,000, maybe 5 digits.
You oversee, of course, political science, and we tend to see phases and periods of discontent and protest, usually, not all the time, but usually at times when the economy is not doing well. I guess my question is, Thailand, like many other countries, is going through perhaps the most difficult economic times in recent memory. Do you think these protests would still be happening if it were different, the economic reality?
Well, these protests preceded the pandemic, in fact, David, because, the Thai economy was struggling, stuck in the middle income trap now for 2 decades. And there's been no economic upgrading. There's been no economic growth strategies going forward. So the economy is not doing well. But the protests, I think, even independent of the economy, they had a lot of grievances. The protesters, young generation, they see Thailand not moving ahead. Certainly economic growth and growth strategies on one hand. But on the other hand, they see a lot of political repression. The conservative establishment has been unwilling to move Thailand, allow Thailand to move forward. And these young people, I think now they're seeing that they have no future. So they've been reclaiming, demanding their future back. And that's why they've called and demanded the resignation of the Prime Minister, the coup maker from 2014, new constitution, and reform of the monarchy. So for them, I think that what to look for now is, whether this parallel universe can merge. There's a lot of critics, a lot of grievances in social media networks, social media technologies and so on, but in the streets, on the ground, fewer. So we will see now if the voices from cyberspace are willing to show up on reality on the ground.
Right. That's a very good distinction to make. There is a big difference between saying something online and actually taking to the streets to push that narrative. So, Professor, among the 3 major things that the students are asking for, what do you think they're going to get?
Well, I think all of them, David, all 3 are very daunting, very difficult. Demanding the sitting Prime Minister to resign, General Prayuth Chan-Ocha, who seized power in 2014 and kind of ran Thailand to the ground over the last 6 years, with no good future ahead. But he's not likely to resign easily. So I think there's a lot of pressure on the protesters, but also on the Prime Minister. And then to come up with a new constitution is very onerous. It's laborious. There's a long, drawn-out process, and also not easy. And reforming the monarchy is the most difficult of all, because I think the royalist establishment will be very reluctant to make any concessions. They would be afraid that any reform would lead to larger and larger reforms and change. So, these are 3 very daunting, tough demands to meet for the establishment, but also the student-led movement. This is their line now. They've staked their credibility, their effort on this line. So something we'll have to give. But in the short term, I think more repression and crackdown. Longer term, if there are no concessions, we're looking at a very combustible situation.
Professor, I know this is a sensitive issue given the lèse-majesté laws in Thailand, but what is the significance of this change in terms of the popularity of the monarchy in Thailand? What's behind it, and what are the longer-term implications?
Well, Tom, if you look at the student movement, student-led protest movement, they have made the distinction. This is a new monarch as opposed to the late monarch, who was very popular, who was on the throne for 7 decades. I think for the new monarch, I think the direction seems to be from the protesters movement, and also I think even a broader grievances is that there has to be new adjustments in new times. New reign means new politics, new arrangements, and perhaps some reform and change. And the bottom line is that Thailand is not moving ahead. This is what the young protesters are demanding. So, for Thailand to move ahead, I think the structure of government, the political structure, the power hierarchy, it has to be recalibrated. Otherwise, Thailand will remain stuck in the 20th century.